I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been taught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been broken.
Good afternoon, good evening. This is Dove Tusman, and you're back on Equal Footing. We've had a lot of requests over the last few years to do more shows on Islam. Yeah, you heard me right. We've done interfaith shows and commentary, lots of them, in fact, over the years, with respect to Christianity, Buddhism, even Hinduism. We've done a couple where we've talked around theological perspectives, Islamic theological perspectives, but mostly at the periphery of our discussions. I'll tell you a couple reasons why it's been tough from a programming perspective. Number one, it's hard to get folks in Islamic studies. Now, I'm not talking about only imams or folks that are embedded in theology from a practicing or pulpitry perspective. But just even from the academic perspective, we struggle to get them on a Jewish network, which I think is a shame, because this show in particular on the Talkline Network is about keeping an open mind and learning, discussing, talking about the tough stuff. We can't do that unless we hear, quote unquote, the other side. That being said, I would also turn the criticism around to our own community that we've struggled to get rabbis and academic authorities that study Islam from a Jewish perspective to get on the air. You know, the discussion doesn't always have to be political. In fact, I would make the argument that for, 1,400 years or at least 1,300 years, for the most part, Jews and Muslims have lived in relative peace. And the politics, if you are, often the bloody politics, was between Christians and Jews, even other religions and Jews. Under the long rule of the Ottoman Empire, Jews were a religious minority, but widely dispersed and overrepresented in the empire's major urban centers in Iberia, modern-day Spain and Portugal, in North Africa, and in the Middle East. Same is true in the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian after the 4th century of the Common Era, but there was also a kind of a tenor of tolerance for a significant period of the time in modern-day Turkey and places like northern Iraq and northern Lebanon and so forth. Now, of course, that's totally different over the last century or so, where, needless to say, the tensions are very high. But why was there this period of coexistence that for millennia? I mean, the Rambam, arguably the greatest religious scholar, certainly greatest legal religious or halachic scholar in Jewish history, was born in southern Spain in an Islamic state at the time and practiced his studies and teaching in modern-day Morocco and modern-day Egypt. Spoke a lot about the coexistence between the faiths. Now, tonight's show, which we've called The Line of Ismael, pronounced Ismail in Arabic or Ishmael in Hebrew, it's inspired by Vayera, the parsha of the moment, and the fact that the Muslim lineage comes out of Torah. Now, we'll get to what Jewish theology would call kind of denial of Torah later. But, and this was something I learned in the prep for tonight's show, the Islam is not supersessionist. I hope I pronounced the word correctly, meaning that Islamic belief does not deny the patriarchs of our tradition. Those patriarchs are seen differently, but they're not denied. Whereas in Christianity, the Christian Bible supersedes. It's a new covenant. It's kind of Control-Alt-Delete Torah and start anew. Now, it gets a little complicated. It's for our guest tonight to help clarify that. But the Quran, Islamic belief, doesn't supersede. It builds on and acknowledges the same principles, Noahide principles, that we believe in. Now, I want to introduce our guest tonight, who is a brave student of this intersection between Jewish theology and Islamic theology. It's a first-time guest on Equal Footing, and we are honored to have him on. It's Rabbi Dr. Mark Shapiro. I'm going to refer to him as Dr. Shapiro on the show because he's not a pulpit rabbi, but is ordained. Dr. Shapiro holds the Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Scranton. He's a graduate of Brandeis University and has a PhD from Harvard. He's the author of numerous books and articles and reviews. He's a popular scholar in residence at synagogues around the world. Dr. Shapiro has written a couple of books that you may have heard of, both of which were finalists for the National Jewish Book Awards. One called Between the Yeshiva World and Modern Orthodoxy, and another, which I highly recommend, called The Limits of Orthodox Theology. Dr. Shapiro's other books include Saul Lieberman and the Orthodox, Studies in Maimonides, we're just talking about Rambam, and his interpreters, and Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. In 2019, Dr. Shapiro published a compendium which contained more than 30 years of correspondence with some of the world's most outstanding Torah scholars. He's regularly published, widely read around the world through his Sefarim blog, and he's currently writing a book on the thoughts of Rav Kook. Dr. Shapiro leads a number of the Torah in Motion Jewish history trips that many of our listeners probably know of. Now, Dr. Shapiro, before I ask you to weigh in, I want to do a slight historical primer for folks. Number one, and this Dr. Shapiro is something that I was able to glean in some of our pregame research from you. That is that Islam was actually the first religion that Judaism confronted from a halakhic perspective that was truly monotheistic. And so when we look at examples of Avodah Zarah, which we'll talk about on the show, the concept of this third rail of idolatry, the examples that we get in Mishnah, the examples that we get in our scholarly tradition is of other religions where there is idolatrous worship. And so that's where you've got to martyr yourself if you're a Jew before you worship idols. There's even restrictions like not having business dealings within a few days of an idolatrous holiday. These are examples that when we look at Islam, we think, oh, they don't apply, because Islam, for any listeners not aware, is a monotheistic religion, right? It is the article of faith in Islam is that there is one God. Second part's more controversial. We'll get to that Muhammad is his prophet. Now, so you would think that there's no kind of real theological issue with another monotheistic faith. You probably remember, I do, in Hebrew school, the little kind of trivia point that could you pray in another place of worship, another religious place of worship? And you can in a mosque. You can't in a church. You can't in another place of worship that is non-monotheistic, because there are pictures of idols. But that in the then in a mosque you can, because there's not idolatry going on. But where is the problem? The problem is in denial of Torah and the idea that there is a superseding prophet in the form of Muhammad. Now I'm kind of buying a little time here as I'm waiting for our guest to join. I'm being told it's an audio issue, but I'm hoping that he's on.
No audio.
Oh, yay! There we go. I thought you were on and then off, but we've got you. Wonderful.
No.
Dr. Shapiro, now I'm feeling embarrassed because for the last couple of minutes, I thought you weren't on. Did I get that right?
Well, some you got right, some you didn't, but some could be clarified, but sound mostly correct, I would say.
Tell me what I got wrong.
Well, one point I would say with regard to Christianity, you mentioned that the issue of praying in a church would be problematic because there's idols, which I assumed you meant crosses or things like that. But even if there weren't any crosses there, it still would be a problem because from the Jewish perspective, the Christian belief is not regarded, at least for Jews, it's not regarded as absolute monotheism. So that would create a problem. But I do want to make a point because I think it's important. Judaism does not regard Christianity as idolatry. Christians don't worship idols. Yes, there's a dispute between Jews and Christians about how to understand God. What Christianity would be regarded as far as Jews are concerned is the term avodah zarah means foreign worship. And Christianity, according to one stream of Jewish tradition, is a permissible religion for non-Jews because they are not obligated to have as pure an idea of God as Jews are. However, as far as Jews are concerned, it's a problem, but it's not idolatry. It's foreign worship. So I think we need to be careful because someone could be offended, say Christians worship idols. It's not true at all. They do believe in one God, but they see it as a little different. They divide him into parts.
So where is there, let's start with the area of commonality. Where is there theological congruence? What as a Jew, where do we coexist halachically with Islam?
Well, from a theological perspective, if you look at the ultimate theological issues about God and his nature, there's absolutely no issues whatsoever with regard to Islam. They're absolute monotheists, complete belief in one God. So from that perspective, they believe in reward and punishment. They believe that the creation of the world, that there's divine providence, that the notion of prophecy. So really, theologically, it's the closest religion to Judaism. We share a lot. Obviously, there are some problems when it comes to revelation. Is it the Torah or is it the Quran? But leaving that aside, on the basic points of theology, there is a lot of congruity, as you say, and it's not an accident that many of our great thinkers, you mentioned Maimonides, but many others, were influenced by Islamic thinkers and had fruitful theological interchange, I guess you could say, with Muslim thinkers, either in person or through the writings of these thinkers.
Where would you say is the point of departure? I was trying to get at it around kind of the concept of accepting Muhammad as the prophet.
Yes,
where's the break point? Where is it that we say, okay, this is not, we cannot halachically coexist?
Well, we can halachically coexist, but because Judaism does believe it. We're not a missionary religion. We don't believe that everyone has to become Jewish. So it's fine for Muslims to be Muslims and Jews to be Jews. However, we cannot agree and acknowledge the truth of the fundamental claim that makes Islam unique, that is, leaving aside the more universal theological claims. And that is, it's the principle of faith. Number one, in Islam, if you say it with conviction once in your life, you are a Muslim. Namely, there is no God but God. Yes, that we can agree with. But the second part, that Muhammad is his prophet, because believing Muhammad is his prophet, that also comes with other matters, including the Quran. And the Islamic idea is that, as you correctly pointed out, it's not that the Jews had a Torah and it was valid, and now it's being replaced by a new revelation, which is the Christian approach. It's that Jews had a revelation, but they messed it up. It's corrupted, and the Quran is presenting the original, authentic vision of God. And for Jews to acknowledge, therefore, that the Quran is authentic means, ipso facto, that the Torah is inauthentic. That our Torah, although in the Islamic conception, Jews were recipients of a revelation, but the holy book that we have, the Torah now, is a far cry from what that revelation was. It's been distorted in multiple ways. So obviously Jews cannot accept that. Jews would be able to accept, according to at least a minority approach in the tradition, that a figure like Muhammad could have been a prophet. Why not? God can send prophets to other nations, but Islam insists on more than that. It insists that we, Jews, have distorted the Torah, or at least in years past we did, and the authentic stories, the authentic vision of God is found in the Quran. So whereas Jews would look at the Quran and see stories that are similar to the ones that Jews have and say, well, they got it sort of right, but they messed it up here and there. From the Islamic perspective, it's the opposite. It's that they have the correct. I mean, this isn't only about Jews, it's about Christians as well. They make the same point about Christians. In fact, in Islam, Jesus is a prophet. Islam shares all of our prophets. Every Old Testament prophet is a prophet for Islam. They think Jesus is a prophet also, but they deny that he was crucified.
I have so many questions around the prophet index. Before we go to our first break, so as a Jew, when we look at the figures of Jesus and Muhammad, I'm talking about theologically. We're not having a political show or talking about like virulence of opinion. But when we look at it halachically, is there a material difference in the way that the prophet figure is presented in Islam? I'm talking from Jewish perspective, in the form of Muhammad versus the way the prophet figure is presented in Christianity in the form of Jesus.
Yeah, a great difference, because Muhammad's a man. Islam insists on that. He's as good as a man could be, but he's a man. And the question between Jews and Muslims would be, when he heard these words that came to him in Mecca, he's out in a cave, and according to Muslims, it's it's the angel Gabriel speaking to him, God's word. Do we accept that or not? And that's Jews and Muslims can disagree, but Christians insist that Jesus is not a prophet. Jesus is the incarnation, God taking form in a human body. And Jews can never accept this notion of a man God, of a God who assumes human form. So that's a very big difference in how Jews, and related to Christianity versus Islam.
So simply put, and I do have the defect of sometimes trying to distill things too much, but in a certain sense, the concept of Muhammad is a more kind of palatable concept. It's a more acceptable concept from a Jewish halachic or theological perspective than the concept of Jesus.
The concept of Muhammad would simply be, is he an authentic prophet or not? And there's lots of prophets who could be authentic or not, and it depends on your perspective. And Jews will not see him as authentic prophet, precisely because he's advocating things that will undermine the Torah. But there is no theological objection if he wasn't speaking against the Torah. He could be a prophet to the nations. We know that the nations had prophets.
It's interesting. We're going to have to take our first break in a second, Dr. Shapiro, but I think last year, and Leah will help me, our wonderful producer, help me remember this. We did a show at some point on the definition of a prophet, and there was some interesting debate at the margin and some discovery of ancient texts that were not discovered until relatively recently, and so it's an interesting discussion unto itself. We'll be right back with Dr. Mark Shapiro. We're talking about the line of Ishmael and of the concept of the theological coexistence between Judaism and Islam, where there's theological congruence and where there's conflict. If you want to participate in this conversation, you can do so live. I'm sorry that I gobbled up some of that initial time, Dr. Shapiro, not realizing you were on. But call in and participate. Give us your point of view. The number to call in live until 8 o'clock is 718-303-9090. That's 718-303-9090. If you're a bit shy to hear your voice on the air, sometimes I am, the number is to text or WhatsApp in a question or comment on this topic is 917-428-4062. Please don't call that number. That's just for WhatsApping or SMSing in a comment or question, 917-428-4062. And we'll be right back. It's a little bit of an odd transition, but Equal Footing is sometimes about the odd, about the stuff that's tough to talk about. Try to put everything on the table. There's no shame in talking about difficult to understand things that cause you distress. One of those things can be erectile dysfunction. There's a wonderful sponsor on this network and for this program that has worked with the community for many years on this issue. It's Manhattan Medical. Manhattan Medical Associates serves patients not just in the Manhattan or New York areas, but from anywhere in the United States. You can get a teleconsult. Stay tuned for the number. It's important to understand that Manhattan Medical understands how emotionally painful and confusing erectile dysfunction can be for men and couples in general. Manhattan Medical doesn't only use those blue pills, other remedies. In fact, their focus therapy is GainsWave. GainsWave therapy is a relatively new and effective enduring therapy for ED that is non-invasive, it's surgery-free, and it's painless. Most importantly, there are no side effects. And for those patients that cannot take pills due to side effects or comorbidities, GainsWave therapy does not have those barriers. Here's the number for Manhattan Medical's ED treatment. It's 888-ED-CURE-9. That's 888-332-8739. I'll give out the number one more time, but let me tell you that if you call Manhattan Medical and mention that you heard about it on the Equal Footing radio show or on the Dove Tusman show, you'll get a free consultation. You don't get that if you just come in off the street or call in. That's a $250 value. From anywhere in the United States, Manhattan Medical's ED therapy. One more time, the number, put it in your phone. Call now because operators are standing by. 888-332-8739.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been told.
All right, Dr. Shapiro, I have so many questions here. You've opened up a Pandora's box. We're talking about Islam from the Jewish theological perspective. So I have it's a point of interest for me, probably not for most anybody else. I'm going to pretend I'm one of those listeners asking a specific question related to my life. I remember my grandfather, Dr. Shapiro, telling me that it was not okay to wish someone a Merry Christmas. You could say Happy Holidays, but you shouldn't say Merry Christmas because within the word, it has the word Christ, which and as you were talking about kind of this man-God concept could be seen as Avodah Zarah. And, but that you could wish someone a happy Ramadan, for example, because there wasn't within the good wish kind of an embedded idolatrous thought. I'm just curious because I don't know who else to ask this question. Did my grandfather have a point?
Well, I don't know if there's any real halachic issue. There is a notion that you don't wish someone the name of, you don't wish good wishes on the holiday if the name of the idol is in the holiday. But the great rabbis have said there really is no issue saying Christmas. Christ is not, it doesn't mean a foreign god. It just means Messiah. So technically it is permitted halachically, but for cultural reasons, and knowing how Jews were persecuted and how their negative feelings to Christianity, they didn't refer to the name of the holiday by the name. They wouldn't refer to Jesus by his name. They use different ways of referring to it. So That's what I would say. That's about Merry Christmas. The Jews won't even mention the name Christmas. They refer to it in other ways. But with Muslim holidays, there never was that issue. There never was a theological problem, a basic theological problem with them. So your grandfather was simply reflecting Jewish tradition.
Blessed memory, who was doing his best to inform me. So another specific question we kind of alluded to at the outset. So you can pray as a Jew, you can daven in a mosque, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, is there when you look at the lineages that we have in our tradition, I'm not asking you to kind of give us Muslim theology, but to your understanding, is, for example, Isaac considered Muslim from an Islamic theological perspective? Are our patriarchs? I understand, for example, Abraham would probably, because that's before Ismael, who's begotten from Hagar, right? So that makes sense to me just chronologically. But what about other points on the chain? Moses, for example. I mean, are these from a Muslim perspective Muslims?
Every prophet mentioned in our scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, is also a prophet for the Muslims, and every one of them, from Adam on, every figure is a Muslim. A Muslim is one who submits to the will of God. So all the great figures in our tradition are also in the Muslim tradition, and they are regarded as Muslims.
And does Muslim theology, from your perspective, kind of grade the prophets in the same way? And I mean that a little bit tongue in cheek, but obviously within Judaism we have tzaddikim, and we have like there's a hierarchy, whether it's explicit or implicit. There's definitely a hierarchy amongst our patriarchs and our prophets. Is it the same kind of hierarchy of holiness, if you can put it that way, from a Muslim perspective?
Well, Islam is very broad, but and there's different approaches to Islam. But generally, they don't grade them, although they do speak about certain prophets as being great. Obviously, Jesus is thought to be very great. Muhammad is very great. But for others, they don't want to go there. They just want to say that Muhammad is the seal of prophecy, the final prophet. But other Muslims do say that Muhammad is the greatest prophet. But they don't. I mean, Jews also don't generally, other than Moses, who's considered the greatest prophet. They don't start grading prophets. Who's greater, Zechariah or Isaiah or Ezekiel? The Jews don't do that either.
Well, to some extent, right? I mean, I think, we see Jacob is more important than Habakkuk, but I hear your point. Now, I want to get to that point, around kind of the sealing prophet, as you will. And I hope that by taking on my actual ignorance, I'm not even playing an advocacy role here, I may be, avoiding embarrassment to some of our listeners. Is Muhammad, a messianic figure, or in in Islam, is there still a Messiah coming in that set of belief?
Yeah, he's the prophet, but they do have many Muslims, and this is basic in Shia Islam. They do have a messianic idea, the final coming, I guess you could say, but it's not Muhammad. Muhammad was here and he died, and there'll be someone else in the future.
So that's a huge difference with Christianity.
Yeah.
Got it. And again, I'm not, this is not even tongue in cheek, but I know I'm greatly simplifying, but in a certain sense, that's more palatable than Christianity, because the idea that the final Messiah has come is one that, we definitely don't believe, or at least the vast majority of Jews don't believe.
Correct. Islam is in line with Judaism much more than Christianity. But Christianity has an advantage also, in that the Old Testament, they share that with Jews. So, they have, each one has an advantage the other doesn't have from the Jewish perspective.
Yeah, and I want to end with that point before we go to our next break, which is, I was fascinated to see, thanks to our producer who sent through a bunch of stats on the views of Muslims and Jews of Muslims and other religions of both. And there's many more Jews believe that Christians are closer religiously than Muslims. I mean, there's a good 30 to 40% gap. So you have, which I think, Dr. Shapiro, if I'm understanding correctly, is kind of theologically wrong. It's kind of mixed up with the politics, but theologically, Muslims are much closer to us than Christians. Would that be a fair general statement?
Absolutely. But what you mentioned is a reflection of the fact that Christians have the same, I guess we would call it the Old Testament. But the God idea of Christianity is completely removed from the Jewish God idea, unlike the Muslim God idea, which is identical to ours. Right.
And so this is not fair. So you can be frustrated with me under your breath on our next ad break here, Dr. Shapiro. But I'm going to actually ask you in some senses to compare Christian and Muslim views of each other and Jews in context. And here's what I mean by that. About 62% of self-identified practicing Christians in the United States, inclusive of Catholics, in the United States, view Jews as more similar theologically to them than Muslims. It's a very similar number for Muslims. So both Muslims and Christians see themselves theologically closer, just talking about theology, closer than Jewish theology. But it seems like everybody's wrong there, right? Did I lose you in the question?
No, but I mean, again, if this is Christian and Muslim self-perception, Christians are looking at the fact that they share the scriptures, and it's more than that. Christianity needs Judaism. You can't be a Christian without Judaism. It's basic to the religion. The whole religion depends on Judaism, and they just move beyond. They take it one step further.
Right. Who is that? I'm asking my producer a question here. It's usually, I know she didn't want to be on the air tonight, but who's that professor from Princeton in religious studies that we had on a year or two ago?
Elaine Pagels.
Elaine Pagels. I'm sure you know who Dr. Pagels is. She's been on the show a couple times, and she said that in very similar language that without Jews there is no Christianity. And on the face of it, it kind of isn't the same. Go ahead.
Christianity is the culmination of Judaism. It is Judaism perfected.
Right. The whole concept of a Messiah doesn't make any sense unless you've got that Jewish backdrop.
But it's not about the Messiah. It's about the fact that through Jesus, Judaism is taken to its perfection. Christianity is Judaism perfected, and that's why you need the Old Testament. So it's by definition, it's tied to that. But Islam doesn't have any connection in that respect with Judaism. Judaism is simply Jews have distorted the authentic message, and Islam is setting it straight.
This is fascinating stuff. We're going to be back in a couple minutes with Dr. Mark Shapiro, who's our ordained rabbi, and we're talking about the line of Ismael, talking about how Islam and Judaism intersect theologically. Just because that's what we're about, we tend to throw out some other stuff, so we're asking some questions about Jesus. And by the way, for those listeners, because I sometimes get questions about where we're getting the stats, some of those percentage stats I was talking about, perception between these religious groups in the United States, was from Statista.com, a poll in 2019 that was done by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, the American Muslim Poll, 2019. We'll be right back on Equal Footing.
Equal Footing with Dove Tusman is sponsored by MDCS Dermatology, your experts in skincare. With 2 Manhattan locations and 4 offices in Long Island, including Plainview and Commack, the dermatologists and skincare surgeons at MDCS are proud to be affiliated with the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and New York Presbyterian Hospital. So schedule your next skin exam in one of MDCS's convenient New York area locations. To make an appointment, go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-DERM. That's 212-661-3376. You can even schedule a virtual video visit with MDCS's board-certified dermatologists from the comfort and safety of your own home. So go to www.mdcs.live or call 212-661-3376. And don't forget to mention Equal Footing for 15% off all cosmetic procedures.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been taught, but I'm keeping on.
You know, I'm always surprised, and Dr. Spear, I'm directing this question kind of behind the, into the studio here to our producer. I'm always surprised at which shows generate a lot of listener engagement. We have like a flood of questions and comments. We do shows on like sexuality and relationship issues and mental health, and we'll get engagement, but it doesn't compare to tonight. And we're doing a theology, I don't know, Dr. Spear, is this theology 101 or is it advanced? It feels like 101 for me. I'm a dummy.
This is pretty 101. Yeah.
All right, good. Note to self, more shows on Islam. By the way, I'm all over the place here, but Dr. Spear, do you get invited to media outlets that are primarily around Muslim audiences to talk about the kind of comparative theology or not?
No.
Interesting. Would you do it if you got invited?
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, you ready? We have a couple of questions from listeners. One is coming in a couple different forms. I'm gonna summarize that we are not bringing up that there are actually direct negative commentaries about Jews in the Quran. That is not really the case in the Christian Bible. That more comes out of Christian theology that evolved over the next couple thousand years through the church, etc. But in the Quran, that's the source. There's anti-Semitism. What do you say to this, listener?
Well, there's anti-Semitism, we would say, in the New Testament. At least it was understood that way by later on. Of course, these are Jews talking about other Jews, but if you look at the whole scene with Pontius Pilate and Jesus, where the Jews are portrayed as saying, "His blood be upon us and our children," and all the negative comments about the Pharisees. So if you want to look in the New Testament, you can find things. Obviously, there's things in the Quran and the later literature. Yes, there's negative things said about Jews.
Now,
Jews
I'm way out on a limb, and Leah, help me out here, but I think when we had Dr. Pagels on talking about this stuff, her argument was that most of that from the Christian Testament perspective was kind of overlaid later, like 100 years later, but that the kind of original books were much more friendly prior to the Roman sacking of Jerusalem, blah, blah, blah. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes, from her book, The Creation of Satan, she described that the othering of Jews specifically happened much later and wasn't part of main Christian doctrine.
Where I think we have a couple listeners here who are saying this is a primary part of Islamic doctrine, but maybe they're wrong. What do you say to that, Dr. Shapiro?
Well, again, about the Christians, the early writers in the New Testament are themselves Jewish. Paul was Jewish.
Right.
So when he attacks Jews, you can't see it as like anti-Semitism the way we think today.
It's factual.
But certainly Jews. Well, there's negative things in the Islamic tradition against Jews. Jews lived as second-class citizens in the Islamic world. That was how Jews and Christians had to live. So there was although Muslims are taught that they have to have a certain amount of respect for Judaism, the religion, we know that Jews were often treated very difficult circumstances, sometimes not so difficult. There are negative comments about Jews, absolutely. Can't deny.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but for someone who's an incognoscenti, what would be a typical citation in terms of an anti-Jewish commentary from the Quran?
Well, I wouldn't say the Quran so much as because you have so much other literature, but one that's been in the news a lot because it's in the Hamas Charter, and it's quoted all the time. It says that in the future, even the stone will call out and say, "There's a Jew hiding behind me, come kill him."
What is that citation from? What text is that from?
From one of the hadiths. Now, it's not everyone regards that as an authentic one, but it's cited. The Quran states explicitly you shouldn't have friends who are Jewish. On the other hand, I don't. You could always look at traditions, including the Jewish tradition, and come up with all sorts of strange or negative statements. There's a passage in the Jewish tradition that talks about that the best of doctors, are going to go to hell. But it's a question. Does that mean we don't like doctors?
Right.
The thing you have to look
and a lot of the times these questions are they're kind of unfair in sound bites in an hour-long program. But in that spirit, let me move on to another question here. There's a listener named Scott who wants to clarify right off the bat that he's Jewish. Thank you, Scott, because it's not necessarily immediately visible as a Jewish name, who says that we're making a mistake in not talking about the history here. Whatever we may think about the current geopolitics, Islam has never been the basis of a crusade or a pogrom. Over the centuries and millennia, it's been the Christians that have used religion to justify genocide of the Jews and other peoples. Islam doesn't, by its nature, justify genocide. What do you say to Scott the Jew?
Well, I would say, first of all, that Christianity never advocated genocide of the Jews. Had they wanted to, they could have very easily wiped out all the Jews. Christian doctrine required that Jews be around. It was basic to Christianity that Jews had to remain and not be physically harmed, let's put it that way. However, Christians, the masses, didn't get the finer points of this theology, and they indeed carried out all sorts of terrible
the
massacres.
masses, maybe the kings, but yeah, I hear your point.
Actually, not the kings. The kings protected the Jews, but it's hard to teach a doctrine that, as the church did, that the Jews are evil, and at the same time say, but they're not to be touched. So that often broke down. But at least theologically, Jews were not supposed to be victims of mass murder. Augustine has this whole notion that Jews have to remain. When you look upon Jews, you see the rejected people, the whole theology there. As for Muslims, Muslims didn't have the same problem with Jews that Christians did. From the Christian perspective, Jews killed their God. It's called deicide, killing of God.
Right.
So Christians always had a theological problem with Jews. Muslims did not. On the other hand, Muslims had the equivalent of crusades. I mean, Islam spread and it conquered North Africa and all the way into Spain. And some of these Muslim rulers were just like crusaders. You had a group called the Almoravids that gave Jews the choice, conversion or death. Now, this is not the standard Islamic doctrine. Mm-hmm. And throughout most of Muslim history, Jews were not presented with problems like this. But there were times that Jews were persecuted by the Muslims. But Scott is correct that Jewish life under the Islamic world, looked at it from the whole, was much better than under the Christian world, or at least better than under the Christian.
A good segue to this is a listener who identifies himself as Rabbi Daniel, who says that he's a fan of yours, Dr. Shapiro, and has listened to some of your talks before. And he thinks it's important to note that Christianity began as a minority religion, whereas Islam, for the most part, after a few years, was a majority religion in its geographical territory. So it felt more secure and more welcoming. It goes on. But is there some truth to Rabbi Daniel's point?
It is true, although it didn't take that long, I think, for Christianity. Give it 100 years or so.
Right. Well, not really, right? Because it's not until the Constantine fourth century.
But he's correct. It was very quickly within. Muhammad was able to conquer Arabia, and within 100 years, you have an Islamic empire stretching from Morocco all the way to close to India in the east, and that is true. But I think the issue is not what Rabbi Daniel mentions. I think the issue is that Islam never had the same theological problem with Jews that Christianity did, and that allowed them to be more tolerant. Islam carved out a place for Jews, a place for believers, Jews and Christians, right, in the Islamic society where they were given autonomy. They had to live second-class citizens, no question about it. There was no equality.
I think part of some scholars, I think including yourself, have pointed out that one of the reasons we see things that way is because there was an overrepresentation of Jews in some of the major Islamic urban centers, and there were libraries and so forth. I have A quick question, and we're going to have to take our final break here before we go to our last segment of the show, from a listener named David, who's listening from Colombia, who's Jewish as well. David, it's nice to have you listening again. And he's asking you, Dr. Shapiro, first of all, I ask for your first name, for your complete name. It's Mark Shapiro, M-A-R-C. So you can look up his work, and we'll make sure. Dr. Shapiro, do you want to call out an easy way for people to find you online?
They can just go to the University of Scranton. They can find me on there.
Okay, University of Scranton, Dr. Mark Shapiro, M-A-R-C-S-H-A-P-I-R-O. And David is asking, which is the hadith of Jews hiding behind rocks? He has another question as well, but that's one of them.
I can't recall now which collection it's preserved in, but it's quite famous and it's cited. But I can tell you that not all Muslims, because I asked a Muslim scholar about this, and he told me that not all Muslims accept this as an authentic hadith. When it comes to hadith,
right,
there's not universal agreement, but it's there. Of course, it's a terrible thing, and what are you going to do? Can't deny it.
Before the break, one more question from David in Colombia. And he's wondering, how many versions of the Quran are there?
There is one version. In the early years, the scholars came together and they worked on it, and because it was oral, and they came together until they were able to produce what they believed to be the best authentic version of it. And so it's not like there's different versions of the Quran. You might have a manuscript that has a word here or there, but it's one. It's one Quran.
Gotcha. We're going to take our last break with you with Dr. Mark Shapiro, The Line of Ismael. We're talking about the coexistence of Islamic and Jewish theology. Namely, we're talking about Islamic theology through the prism of Jewish thought. We'll be right back. If you want to participate, keep those questions and comments coming. 917-428-4062 is the line to send in a text, comment, or question. That's 917-428-4062. I've just been told that we didn't have the right screen up in the studio for the call, so I'm sorry for those that we missed. You can call in and we'll get you now. The call-in number is 718-303-9090. Hopefully we'll get to at least one or two calls after the break. 718-303-9090 to call in, and we'll be right back.
All my life I've been waiting for, I've been praying for the people to say that we don't want to fight no more. There'll be no more wars, and our children will play one day.
Equal Footing is lucky to have a great sponsor in Mechanical Art Capital. Mechanical Art Capital gets you cash quickly, overnight, or maximum 2 days for your watch or jewelry inventory, if you're a watch or jewelry dealer, or your watch collection, if you're a collector. You don't have to sell them. You're not financing them. It's a halachically sound way to get cash. It's a buyback program. And if you need some liquidity to expand your business or do something in your home, you can get it based on your watch or jewelry collection. Check it out on the app, Mechanical Art Capital. Those 3 words you put into your Android device or your iPhone. 3 words, mechanical space art space capital. You just upload some photos and you get an offer within a couple hours. You can get your money the next day, and you can go to their website, mechanicalartcapital.com, and we'll be right back. Or that's it. Back to music.
I've been caught, but I'm keeping on check. And I've been told.
All right, you are back on Equal Footing, and Leah, I don't think I've had as many technical questions to you as tonight as before. Are lines back up for calling? Are they working or no?
We have a caller on the line, yes.
But how do we get him on the board? Trying to figure that out? Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, we're having technical difficulties. Dr. Shapiro, I hope you won't judge. I hope you'll be back again. We're usually a little bit more fluid, but boy, people are interested in the topic. We have let's take another couple questions, and I want to go back to one of the general questions that I have. A listener asks, Dr. Shapiro, why is Islam self-qualified as a religion of peace? Whereas in Judaism, for all the wonderful things we call ourselves, I've never heard us say we're a religion of peace.
Well, I think part of that has to do with the fact that today, with everything going on in the Islamic world, and we look out and we see violence and terrorism and wars throughout much of the Islamic world. Therefore, for those Muslims who don't share these beliefs, they want to distance themselves from that. So therefore, they make a point of saying that we are
that's a really good point. I didn't think of that. You're saying it's kind of like you need to create that differentiation because, in fact, there's so much violence perpetuated in the name of Islam.
Yeah, and in the West, people like to say that Islam's a religion of violence. So therefore, people who don't follow that type of Islam want to stress that, no, we're a religion of peace. The truth is that Islam is both a religion of violence and a religion of peace. It depends which practitioner of Islam you're dealing with.
So, Rabbi, a listener named Andrea writes that I am a Reformed Jew. I am not a peacenik. However, I think the only way for us to get to peace is by understanding each other and embracing our areas of commonality. Could the rabbi list the 3 primary areas in which we are the same, putting aside our differences? And I'm going to add to your question, Andrea, just to be fair to Dr. Shapiro, maybe say theologically. What are the primary 3 areas in which theologically we are the same? That is Muslims and Jews.
Well, I would say the belief in one God, the belief in a God who cares about this world, who judges this world, who has exposed himself to this world through revelation, who exercises divine providence, a God who requires the people to treat others with dignity, et cetera, et cetera. These are all basic things that we share with Islam, at least classic Islam.
Where do you think, okay, I threatened to ask we're almost up at time. So many good questions here. Okay, a listener named Sarah asks, do you think Islamism and radical jihad will eventually die out? Or are we just living in an unfortunate time of heightened manipulation of the core beliefs of Islam?
If you take the long view, you can see there have been many ups and downs. We have, just like today, we have radical Islamism and jihadism. We had this in the past as well. And it came and it went. So we have to assume that this will also go just like it came. However, it could be 100 years. It's not like there's no reason to assume that in any of our lifetimes we're going to see the end of this. But if you take the long view, this will come and this will go just like it has in the past.
I may be unfairly twisting or extending, I should say, Sarah's question, but I think it is interesting to point out that what's on the written page of Islamic theology, if I'm understanding your scholarly work and your comments on the show tonight, are not ultimately as problematic as what's, I guess, in a sense, on the written page or in Christian theology. But Sarah wrote, it's heightened manipulation. Another way to say it is we're kind of, the current Islamic militants or folks that are using Islam as a basis for violence are really kind of off the theological reservation. So it's an interesting optimistic note.
But I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't phrase it like that. It's not for us. We're not Muslims to say that. The jihadis have their interpretation of Islam. It's like I wouldn't say that Catholics are the only true Christians and Presbyterians are not. Each one has, this is an interpretation of Islam, this radical interpretation, which is advocated and held to by many, many millions of people. So it is an authentic interpretation. If a Muslim wants to say it's not an authentic interpretation, he can say that. It's his religion. And he'll be personally affected that they're doing that. But for us as outsiders, we have to look at it. You have a country like Iran, you have Gaza, you have Lebanon. These are not Muslims? Of course they're Muslims. And for non-Muslims to say that you're not practicing Islam properly, that's not really how we should look at it. We should simply say and acknowledge that there are different ways of interpreting Islam, and some are friendly to the West and to us as Jews, and others are very much in opposition to us. And that's how I would put it.
It's a great segue into what may end up being the last question here that we have time for. And this was from a caller who called in, and thanks, Leah, for grabbing his question. I want to apologize to our listeners that we've had a glitch tonight. For some reason, we're not able to patch the calls through from the head end into the studio. So we'll get that fixed. Or actually, I think it may have been part of the transition of going on to the HD on FM or whatever, but I'm told over the next couple of weeks things are going to get better. We shall see. We may even be switching our location. We broadcast from deep in Brooklyn and Sheepshead Bay, and we may be moving to a different location. This question comes from Stan, who called in. And thank you, Stan, as always, for your input. It says, since we're doing a show on Islam, why are we doing it on an Orthodox Jewish network? And I wanted, Leah, you to be on the mic as well. It's like, in a sense, I think this question is for all three of us. So Dr. Shapiro, it's the most unfair to ask you to answer it, probably more directed at the two of us. But how do you feel about talking about Islamic theology through a Jewish prism, through a Jewish frame of analysis?
Well, originally, if you recall, the talk was supposed to be about how Jewish theology, Judaism, halacha, theology views Islam.
Yes.
Somehow, though, it turned into, maybe through the questions, more discussions of Islam.
Right.
But really, my expertise is not in Islam per se. For that reason, there's plenty of people to talk to. My area is really how Judaism views Islam. So, but it's okay. These are important issues, even though this is what people wanted to ask. I'm very happy offering my perspective.
I think, Doctor, what happened is that we rarely, maybe because of political or cultural reasons, we rarely have people of the Muslim faith on this network. And people, our listeners, are dying to get more information out of you, hence the influx of questions and calls and questions they have about like Muslim theology. So that's why it's in a different way.
I agree with Leah. Stan, I think the answer is here on the air is that, and Dr. Shapiro is absolutely right. We're talking about Jewish theology as it relates to Islam, or that's what I was supposed to do. So blame me if it went off course. But the fact that there is a lot of engagement tells you why. Because that's kind of part of the philosophy of the show, is to talk about the stuff that no one else is talking about, and to do so as fearlessly as we can. And sometimes we get beat up about it. I wish we had you on the air, Stan. I'm sorry, because I want to hear your follow up. To wrap things up, Dr. Shapiro, we'd love to have you on again.
Okay.
What is, if, let's say, I lived in, some listeners know, I lived in Dubai for many years. And this was before the most recent accord. So it was before you could be really openly Jewish in Dubai safely. And I went to kind of an we would daven underground. There was a minyan, in fact, a fairly sizable Jewish community, but we did everything underground. This was a while ago. I left there in terms of being my living base, for business reasons. I was there back a number of years ago, over 10 years ago. However, out of that experience and out of other Jews' experience living in Muslim lands, what is kind of a generalized theological guidance that you would give to Jews in the way that we should see Islam? I don't mean see Muslims or certainly don't mean see an Islamic organ of state, but just in the last minute that remains here, what are your words of wisdom to guide us as Jews into how we should see Islam as a religion?
I think we should adopt Maimonides' position that Islam is a step in the divine plan, divine providence, helping lead a significant part of the world to a belief in one God. And that doesn't mean that from our perspective they get everything right, but fundamentally it's a pure belief in God, and it's a kosher religion. Let's put it that way, from a theological perspective.
I like
and
that.
We should respect it.
It's not what I expected you to hear. I think that's really important. I think if we can divide the way people interpret, or as one listener said, manipulate Islam from the core beliefs, I think we also are more credible in engagement.
Agreed.
Dr. Shapiro, thank you so much for being on Equal Footing. Sorry for our technical issues. I hope we can make it up to you. And people should look out for Dr. Mark Shapiro's work. You can Google University of Scranton, Dr. Mark Shapiro, and follow his ongoing dialogue in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hip took a while for you to find me. But I was hiding in the lime tree. Above the city in the rain cloud. I poked a hole and watched it drain out.